He has been regarded as the father of Western Methodism. William McKendree was shaped by the fires of the American frontier revival. He answered the call to ministry as a circuit rider, proclaiming the gospel through rugged terrain across remote settlements. He was the first American-born bishop of the Methodist Episcopal Church, and his leadership helped solidify and expand the Methodist movement in a rapidly growing nation. From his early days as a Revolutionary War soldier to his later years as a respected bishop, McKendree's life was marked by conviction, courage, and a profound commitment to spreading the love of Christ. So join us on this historical episode of the Methodical Methodist podcast as we explore the life and legacy of Bishop William McKendree. William McKendree was born in King William County, Virginia on July 6, 1757. He was the oldest of 8 children born to John and Mary McKendree. William was the oldest. Lucinda, Dorotha, Frances Ann, John, Thomas, James, and Nancy followed. William's parents, John and Mary, were an intelligent, faithful, and well-respected couple who belonged to the middle class in Virginia. Their last name, McKendree, indicates that they were of Scottish descent, but their ancestors most likely made their way to America out of Northern Ireland. John McKendree, William's father, was moral and virtuous, but he was also just an ordinary individual. He was a farmer who made a comfortable living, but he never accumulated a significant fortune or social prominence. In his biography of William McKendree, Bishop Robert Payne describes John McKendree by saying, "With strong domestic affections and without any desire for notoriety, he led a humble, industrious, and religious life." John and his family moved to James City County in 1764, and then again to Greenville County in 1770. And then in 1810, John moved away from Virginia along with his youngest son, Dr. James McKendree, his son-in-law, Charles Harris, and their families, and his 2 unmarried daughters, and they made their way to Sumner County in the state of Tennessee. And then in October 1815, John passed away on his 88th birthday. Mary McKendree, William's mother, was a strong yet gentle woman. We don't know her maiden name, but some speculate it was Dudley, which was a common name that appears often in his family lineage. But she cared and loved for her family and performed several domestic duties in the household. However, in 1769, Mary became so ill that she was confined to her room and mostly to her bed. And her sickness continued for nearly 20 years until her eventual death in 1789. Bishop Robert Payne describes her saying, "Such sweetness of temper, so many sensible lessons upon the properties of life, and such a consistent exemplification of the purity and power of religion as she exhibited throughout these long years of affliction, made an ineffaceable impression upon her children." And doubtless that impression was stronger from the fact that these lovely traits were seen in a fond and suffering mother. When William McKendree was born, the colonies were first starting to experience discontent with Great Britain. Most of the people in Virginia carried a great reverence for England and still called it home. But a lot changed over the preceding years. William was about 19 years old when the Revolutionary War broke out. And as a young man, William served in the Virginia militia during the American Revolutionary War. First, he served as a private, and then he served as an adjutant, which was an assistant to a commanding officer in the commissary department. In 1781, at the age of 24, McKendree was present at the siege of Yorktown and the surrender of General Charles Cornwallis. Bishop Payne notes, "In him the soldier of civil liberty was merged into the nobler character of a true and valiant soldier of the cross. Having done his duty to his country in an emergency, He was contented and never boasted of the fact. After the American Revolutionary War ended in 1783, McKendree returned to life as a civilian and began working as a schoolteacher. And then in 1787, the Methodist evangelist John Easter came to town and began preaching in the Brunswick circuit where William McKendree lived. Now, at this point in William's life, as a 30-year-old, he did not have a close relationship with God. In fact, there's one occasion when he went to visit one of his neighbors who was heading to church to hear a sermon from a local preacher named Mr. Gibson. And when McKendree arrived at this neighbor's home, the neighbor stayed home while his wife and one of the servants went on to church. And so McKendree and his friend stayed home. They spent the morning drinking wine and reading a comedy. And when the neighbor's wife returned, she talked about how the preacher had brought tears to people's eyes, cries of forgiveness, and shouts of joy. She then informed them that John Easter would be preaching at the same place on the following Tuesday. McKendree was touched by this report, and he began thinking seriously about his own faith. On Tuesday morning, he arrived at the church fasting and praying. John Easter preached about God's grace, especially about God's sanctifying grace, which allows you to grow deeper in your relationship with God and to become more like Christ. Easter came back a month later, and McKendree writes about his experience seeing John Easter preach by saying this: "My convictions were renewed. They were deep and pungent. The great deep of my heart was broken up. Its desperately wicked nature was disclosed, and the awfully ruinous consequences clearly appeared. My repentance was sincere. I was desirous of salvation and became willing to be saved upon any terms. And after a sore and sorrowful travail of 3 days, which were employed in hearing Mr. Easter and in fasting and prayer, while that man of God was showing a large congregation the way of salvation by faith, with a clearness which at the same time astonished and encouraged me, I ventured my all on Christ. In a moment my soul was delivered of a burden too heavy to be borne, and joy instantly succeeded sorrow. For a short space of time I was fixed in silent admiration, giving glory to God for his unspeakable goodness to such an unworthy creature." William McKendree went on to find an assurance in his faith, and he began taking his faith seriously. As he grew in knowledge and experienced God's sanctifying grace, McKendree started to have thoughts of entering the ministry. At first he struggled with this. Why did God call him? Was he really called? What if he failed? And then one day, as he was sitting at the table, his father realized that William was confused and about his sense of calling, wasn't sure what to do. And so William's father said to him, "William, has not the Lord called you to preach the gospel? I believe he has, and I charge you not to quench the Spirit." William was thunderstruck, and he and his father began to cry, and William asked him why he thought the Lord had called him. And his father talked about a time when William was very sick, and he wasn't sure if he was going to survive. The doctor and his friends had believed he wasn't going to make it. And John was fearful of his son's salvation, so he began to pray, and he felt God give him an assurance. He felt God tell him, "Your son will live to preach the gospel." And he never lost that assurance, so he repeated his words to William, "Do not quench the Spirit." Ironically, after this conversation, William became sick again, and John Easter came to visit him, and he prayed a prayer, not a normal, get better soon prayer, but a strong prayer that called William to rise up because the work is plenty, but the laborers are few. 9 months later, in the summer of 1788, John Easter invited William McKendree to attend the district conference in Petersburg, Virginia. McKendree attended the conference where there was prayer, and then they read the preacher's appointments. He was brought into the room, and it was announced that he was being appointed to the Mecklenburg circuit as an assistant preacher with Philip Cox. This was a complete surprise to McKendree, and he was in complete shock. Some of the young clergy kind of helped calm him down. And after the meeting, the presiding elder of the conference, James O'Kelly, said to him, While you were standing before the conference, I believe God showed me that He had a work for you to do. Don't deceive me." McKendree resolved to trust the judgment of the clergy, to put away his doubts, and to get to work in the best way that he could. And so after about 8 months, his heart was fixed. He was sent out for his circuit, and he went and served the Mecklenburg circuit as a junior preacher. He wasn't licensed or ordained, but he went about the work of a preacher along with the lead pastor, Philip Cox, who was an Englishman. He was an instructor and kind of a father figure to McKendree. He really cared for him. He really looked after him, kind of showed him the ropes. And the Mecklenburg circuit was full of deeply experienced Christians, many of whom were converted in the days of Robert Williams, who was the one who actually had converted John Easter to Christ. And so the people in the circuit, they were very kind to McKendree. He said that he experienced trials, but they also experienced some sweet moments together as well. And after a year, he continued to serve there again for another year because the congregants there were unwilling to part with him. The following year, in 1789, McKendree was sent to the Cumberland Circuit in Virginia for about 6 months, and then he returned to the Mecklenburg Circuit. At the conference at Petersburg on June 14, 1790, McKendree completed his probation period and he was admitted into full connection. He was elected and ordained a deacon. And then he went on to serve at the Portsmouth Circuit with Jesse Nicholson in charge. And he then went that year with William Spencer to the Surrey Circuit. And he continued to grow in his faith and in his skills as a preacher during this time. The doubts that he had experienced about his calling subsided to a large degree. He was more comfortable in his role and in the pulpit. And then at the next conference in 1791, McKendree was sent to Amelia Circuit, along with his colleague John Baldwin. And then the conference was changed from spring to the Christmas holiday. So the December conference of 1791 met at Lane's Chapel, and this is where McKendree was ordained as an elder on Sunday, December the 25th. And at the close of that conference, he went to the Greenville Circuit with Joel Thacker as his assistant. He did not want to go because it put him in the midst of some of his old acquaintances who were in societies before him and had considered themselves as superior to him. But he went willingly, and it ended up being a good appointment for him. During this time, however, there started to be some divisiveness spring up among the Methodist connection. His presiding elder, James O'Kelly, became increasingly uncomfortable with the growing authority of bishops in the newly formed Methodist Episcopal Church. After the church's official organization in 1784, bishops like Francis Asbury held significant power, especially in appointing preachers to their circuits without much input from the preachers themselves. O'Kelly saw this centralized control as contrary to the spirit of Methodism, which had emphasized personal conviction, simplicity, and accountability. And this tension came to a head at the 1792 General Conference when O'Kelly proposed a motion that would allow preachers to appeal their assignments if they felt they were unjust. This was the O'Kelly plan, and it was ultimately voted down, reinforcing the authority of bishops like Asbury. O'Kelly was frustrated by what he saw as an undemocratic structure, and so he withdrew from the Methodist Episcopal Church a few years later. But during this time, McKendree very much sided with O'Kelly. They were friends. O'Kelly was his presiding elder. They had a good relationship, and McKendree believed what O'Kelly had told him about the tyranny of Francis Asbury. But during the proceedings, McKendree was surprised at how mild-mannered and calm Asbury was. And in the following year, Francis Asbury traveled among many of the Virginian preachers. He set out on a tour of what had long been O'Kelly's district. And Asbury came across McKendree in his travels. He stayed at his home, and the two ended up really enjoying each other's company. And Asbury invited McKendree, by special request, to be his traveling companion for a few weeks. And during these few weeks, McKendree realized that the discipline of the Methodist Church was entirely different than what he had expected. Asbury was not the tyrant that O'Kelly had told him he was, and this caused him to start to withdraw his confidence from his old and, quote, best beloved friend O'Kelly. As a side note, in 1794, James O'Kelly went on to create a new denomination, initially called the Republican Methodist Church, which later became known simply as the Christian Church. His movement emphasized congregational governance, and they rejected kind of hierarchical leadership, and they had a commitment to identifying solely as Christians without denominational labels. His disagreement with Francis Asbury became one of the first major leadership rifts in American Methodism. But this was a really difficult time for McKendree because he felt like he had lost a friend, and so he leaned on Ira Ellis, who had become his new presiding elder. And McKendree writes of their friendship, saying, "He was a comfort to me. From him I obtained information and counsel which were of inestimable value to me in my dilemma." Then, on November 25th, 1793, the conference met at Petersburg with 55 preachers present and Bishop Francis Asbury presiding. McKendree was moved to the Union Circuit in South Carolina. This was the first time that he had been sent outside his home state. He hadn't even really traveled outside of Virginia much, with the occasional exception of going to Maryland. So in this new appointment, he was under the leadership of the presiding elder, Philip Bruce, who was from North Carolina. McKendree ended up spending a quarter of this year as the traveling companion of Bishop Asbury, while his circuit was supplied by Tobias Gibson, who later became the founder of Methodism in Mississippi. The Virginia Conference met at Salem Chapel in Mecklenburg County on November 24th, 1795, where Bishop Francis Asbury appointed McKendree to lead a district which stretched from the Chesapeake Bay northward and westward over the Blue Ridge and the Allegheny Mountains, and included a stretch on the Western Waters. It was a huge area to cover on horseback, but McKendree did this for 3 full years with a small salary of $64 each year, but apparently was only paid about half of that sum. So he lived a very frugal and modest life. He had become a very well-respected and strong leader among his fellow clergy. On the occasion of McKendree's death, Bishop Sewell talked about McKendree's leadership during this time in his life, writing, "The oversight of the district and the administration of the discipline was conducted with great wisdom and prudence, and to the satisfaction of the preachers and members. The spirit of schism, which had previously prevailed in some parts of the district, greatly subsided, and the love of union, peace, and order was revived." In 1799, McKendree was moved from his district in the Virginia Conference to one in the Baltimore Conference. It was slightly smaller than his last district, only to go back to his district in Virginia the following year in 1800. In the fall of 1800, Bishop Francis Asbury and newly elected Bishop Richard Watcote paid McKendree a visit in Greenbrier County on their way to the western frontier. They came with a specific proposal. For about 10 years, the work in Kentucky and Tennessee had been lagging, and they needed someone who could get things organized and moving. The two bishops believed that McKendree was the man for the job, and McKendree left right away. In fact, according to Bishop McIntyre, he therefore went at 3 hours' notice. While reflecting back on this moment, McKendree himself wrote, "I was without money, books, or clothes. These were at a distance, and I had no time to go after them. But I was not in debt, therefore unembarrassed. Of money due me, I collected $100, bought cloth for a coat, carried it to Holston, and left it with a tailor in the bounds of my new district. The bishops continued their course. My business was to look after them and wait on them, for they were both infirm old men." McKendree was 43, Asbury was 55, and Watcote was 65, but the three of them made their way through southwest Virginia and east Tennessee down to the home of Edward Cox on the Holston River. They continued traveling throughout Tennessee and on into Kentucky. They finally reached Bethel Academy in the bend of the Kentucky River on October 4th, 1800, for a conference. During the conference, which met October 4th through the 6th in 1800, it only had 5 preachers on the roll call, other than the 2 bishops: William McKendree, William Burke, John Stale, Hezekiah Harriman, and Benjamin Lakin. 3 others were readmitted: Lewis Hunt, Thomas Allen, and Jeremiah Lawson. 2 were admitted on trial: William Marsh and Benjamin Young. And then 14 local preachers and 4 traveling preachers were ordained as deacons. The salaries of the preachers were only $8 a year. And McKendree was put in charge of the entire Western District, which was massive. It was comprised of the whole state of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio, with a large part of Virginia. It also supplied missions to be established in Illinois, Mississippi, and Missouri. The district was divided into 9 circuits, supplied by 14 men. So McKendree certainly had his work cut out for him, but he found very good success in evangelizing the West. McKendree traveled extensively, supervising preachers, organizing circuits, and holding quarterly meetings. His efforts helped bring structure and stability to the rapidly expanding Methodist movement in the West. McKendree was also closely involved in the early revival movement known as the Second Great Awakening. He supported and participated in large camp meetings that contributed to a surge in conversions and church growth. His leadership during this period emphasized both spiritual renewal and practical organization. McKendree's success in the Western District brought him wider recognition. And during a conference held in Sumner County, Tennessee on October 2nd, 1802, they divided McKendree's district into 3: Holston, Cumberland, and Kentucky. There were great gains in membership, and the conference was really pleased with McKendree and his work. And there was a lot of hope for the future of Methodism in this area. Meanwhile, McKendree was also caring for Asbury, who was constantly battling sickness. Asbury spoke often of McKendree's help in his journals. On 2 occasions he wrote, "Brother McKendree made a tent of his own and happily saved me from taking cold while I slept about 2 hours under my grand marquee." And then he also wrote, "I've been sick for 23 days. Oh, the tale of woe I might relate. My dear McKendree had to lift me up and down from my horse like a helpless child." In October of 1804, the conference met, but Bishop Asbury and Bishop Watcoat were unable to attend. In the absence of the 2 bishops, McKendree was elected president, and he was designated to perform all the duties of the episcopal office except for the ordination of deacons and elders. At the next year's conference, because McKendree had already served 5 years, he was removed from the Kentucky to Cumberland districts, which included Middle and West Tennessee, Mississippi, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. And then the General Conference of 1808 met in Baltimore, Maryland, and McKendree was scheduled to preach the Sunday before the conference at the Light Street Church. Even though his appearance was kind of disheveled and his clothes were a little unkempt, he preached a very powerful message that moved the congregation. In fact, Bishop Asbury was present and was heard to say, "That sermon will make him a bishop." Sure enough, during the conference, the delegates moved to elect William McKendree as a new bishop to support the aging Asbury and to help lead the growing church. He was the first American-born bishop of the Methodist Episcopal Church, and this was very much needed considering Richard Watcoat passed away on July 5th, 1806. So McKendree immediately set out traveling, preaching, attending camp meetings, and conducting conferences. He traveled in Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, Washington, New York, Maine, Pennsylvania, Ohio, all the while conducting conferences and meetings and preaching everywhere he went. The work of a bishop was nonstop. Still, McKendree moved to Nashville, Tennessee, where his permanent residence remained until the end of his life, even though he was constantly traveling around. McKendree's first general conference as a bishop took place at Old John Street Church in New York City in May 1812. This conference was the first general conference held under the delegated system, meaning that elected representatives rather than all itinerant preachers participated. That was a change that was approved in the 1808 General Conference. And in an opening address, Bishop William McKendree proposed a more balanced and collaborative relationship between the bishops and the General Conference. And he stated that he believed bishops should have unilateral authority over the church, which was a big thing to say. But he also said that they should be accountable to the General Conference. When McKendree finished his short address, Asbury was taken by surprise because Asbury kind of viewed William McKendree as a junior bishop. And so Asbury stood up and he said, "I have something to say to you before the conference." McKendree got to his feet and the two bishops stood face to face. Asbury said, "This is a new thing. I never did business in this way. And why is this new thing introduced?" It was clear that Asbury was agitated. But McKendree politely responded, "You are our father, and we are your sons. You never had any need of it. I'm only a brother, and I have need of it." His comment kind of helped soothe Asbury's feelings. It was clear at this point in Asbury's life that his health was starting to decline. And even though it was clear that Asbury was no longer fit for service, the Committee on Episcopacy still recommended that no additional bishops should be elected. And this was really a big burden on William McKendree. He was given an impossible task of essentially leading the church on his own. He was in full swing even after an accident on horseback, which threw him off his horse and injured his hip. After taking a short time of recovery, he continued his work. And then, on March 24th, 1816, Asbury preached his last sermon in Richmond, Virginia. He was so sick and so weak that he had to actually be carried into the church, and he sat on a table while he preached. And then just a few short days later, at the home of George Arnold in Spotsylvania County, Asbury breathed his last breath. McKendree was now alone in his office. He was suffering from severe pain. He made it clear to the conference that there was a need for more bishops when he said, "Such is the manifest weakness of the superintendency at present that it cannot fully discharge all the duties connected with this department." And so the Committee on Episcopacy recommended the election of two new bishops, Enoch George of the Baltimore Conference and Robert R. Roberts of the Philadelphia Conference were chosen. McKendree's first course of action was to devise a plan for distributing the work among the three of them. He saw no reason why all three of them should attend every annual conference, and the two new bishops agreed with him. So they decided to alternate the circuit of conferences, changing their fields every year, and that would allow each of them to be present in every part of the church every few years and kind of help maintain the connection. They also arranged that if for some reason two or more bishops are present at the same annual conference, one should be the responsible president while the others act as advisors. Roberts and George took turns attending a few conferences with McKendree to learn from him, but this new model made their work much more manageable. Then one day, while McKendree was on his way to the Mississippi Conference, he had what he described as a sudden shock, and he nearly fell off his horse. Over the next 2 weeks, 2 other shocks followed. Nevertheless, he forced himself to continue working and led the proceedings in Mississippi. Following that conference, he took some time to be with his family. He spent some time with some friends in Kentucky and Ohio. It was a restorative time in his life. He traveled again through East Tennessee and Virginia, and he closed out his 12th year of his general superintendency. Even though he was exhausted, he was held in high esteem, and the whole church had a lot of affection for him. During the General Conference of 1820, all 3 of the bishops were there. McKendree, the senior bishop, took the chair and presented a written address, while Roberts and George both made an oral address. The Committee on Episcopacy had seen how tired and worn out McKendree was. The report recommended that McKendree be relieved of all his duties except those he chooses, and that his funds be increased to cover extra expenses from his illnesses. McKendree was deeply moved by this gesture of generosity, and the Committee on Episcopacy also recommended one additional bishop, be elected and ordained at General Conference. Voting commenced, and the count showed that Joshua Sewell had 48 votes and Nathan Banks had 38. But before Sewell could be ordained, a resolution appeared that derailed the proceedings. If passed, this resolution would allow annual conferences rather than bishops to elect their own presiding elders. Debate on this issue lasted for 2 full days, and it was moved that a special committee of 6 people, 3 from each side of the issue, meet with the bishops to see if there could be a compromise. The committee was comprised of Ezekiel Cooper, John Emery, Nathan Bangs, Samuel G. Roswell, Joshua Wells, and William Capers. The bishops themselves disagreed on this issue. McKendree was against this resolution, as was Roberts, although he wasn't as vocal. And George was completely silent at first, but then eventually revealed that he was in favor of the resolution. This led to a new resolution that was put before the conference and adopted 61-25 that essentially gave more power to the annual conference to elect their own presiding elder, and that they become a part of the advisory council of the bishop in stationing the preachers. Joshua Sewell, who had been elected as a new bishop, was strongly against this action of the General Conference, and he claimed it was unconstitutional. Therefore, he could not take up the work of a bishop under these circumstances. So then, on Monday morning, May 22nd, Bishop William McKendree presented a protest. At one point in his strongly worded address, he says, "I extremely regret that you have, by this measure, reduced me to the painful necessity of pronouncing the resolution unconstitutional and therefore destitute of the proper authority of the Church. While I am firmly bound by virtue of my office to see that all the rules are properly enforced, I am equally bound to prevent the imposition of that which is not properly rule. Under this influence of the sentiment and considering the importance of the subject, I enter this protest." The bishop had planned without Sewell's knowledge to go ahead and ordain him as bishop, but before that happened, a new resolution was brought forth from D. Ostrander and James Smith saying that Sewell should not be ordained because he had already written and signed a letter declining his election as bishop in protest. So this was tabled until General Conference of 1824, where Joshua Sewell and Elijah Heading were both eventually elected as bishops. After the close of the General Conference in 1828, McKendree left by steamboat. He went down the Ohio River into Kentucky, where he preached while making his way to Tennessee, to the home of his brother in early autumn. That fall, he attended several camp meetings near Nashville. Right before winter, he had a dangerous ride across Lookout Mountain near Chattanooga. But while he was there, he preached to the Grand Council of the Cherokee Indians, who always received him and treated him very kindly. He continued to travel, preach, and preside at conferences. In the early winter of 1829 into 1830, he spent time in Nashville with some of his friends. Then in January, he continued traveling mainly on the steamboat Nashville. But by the next winter, he was worn out and he went into temporary retirement until the spring of 1831. McKendree, getting older and frailer, came and went at will. Everyone treated him with deference and kindness. Twice in December, McKendree preached at the new McKendree Church in Nashville. And on the last night of the year in 1835, he conducted a watch night service there as well. During that experience, he wrote in his journal, "It was a solemn time. I felt my spiritual strength renewed. I returned with Brother Hill and his family, and at 4 o'clock, I arose afresh." It was in Nashville, Tennessee, at McKendree Church on November 23rd that Bishop McKendree preached his last sermon, where a large audience was present and lingered on his words. He made one last journey to visit his brother, who was 30 miles away. He wanted to spend his last days with him. He arrived before Christmas Day, but he took to bed very soon after, and he never left it. He was loved by all of his family there in the house. He was idolized, especially by his sister Nancy. And then on March 5th, he said to his friends, "Follow me as I have followed Christ, only closer." That day his struggle ended and he entered into rest. He was buried next to his father in the adjacent graveyard, but then 40 years later his remains were reinterred along with Joshua Sewell's in the campus of Vanderbilt University. From the frontier circuits to the Episcopal office, McKendree played a central role in shaping American Methodism during a time of rapid growth and change. His influence is still felt, not just in the churches that bear his name, but in the structures he helped establish and the steady leadership he offered in a critical season of the church's life. He was truly an incredible figure in the Methodist movement.